Hello and welcome to King's Cross in central London. We're here at the Francis Crick Institute for the fourth of our leader interviews. Now, this is still a construction site, but it will soon be the largest biomedical laboratory in Europe. When it opens, scientists from all over the world will be here peering into test tubes. Right now, though, we're using this cool location to meet British political leaders and to peer into their minds and hear their visions for the country. Tonight, I'm with Nigel Farage, leader of UKIP. Nigel Farage, you have criticised the establishment parties. Let me quote something at you. As the 7% that go to public schools dominate politics, the media, the arts, sport, every aspect of our life in this country, we've almost reached a situation where the only time these guys have met a working class man or woman is if they're driving the car.
Yes.
Tell us about your schooling.
Yeah, I was very lucky. I went to a school called Dulwich College in South London, which has been there for nearly 400 years.
It's a public school,
which was founded for 12 poor scholars and was all paid for by a benefactor. And interestingly, it was a tradition that they kept for many, many years. And after World War II, up until the year that I went there, 50% of the boys in my year came from working class backgrounds and were paid for by local education authorities.
You weren't one of those, though.
As part of what was called the Assisted Places Scheme. I wasn't one of those, no, but the interesting thing was that through school and then through working in the metals industry on the London Metal Exchange, you know, I always worked with and I've always mixed with a very large cross-section of society.
Look, let's just be clear about this. By about 1990, you'd been to a public school, you were working in the city, and you had been a long-standing member of the Conservative Party. Now, some would say it's a bit of a barefaced cheek for you to say to the others, oh, you all establishment public school types, come on.
But what the others are saying is, I'm all right, Jack, let's pull up the ladder and not give people who didn't have the same opportunities as us the chance to get on. And what I'm saying is that actually it's wrong that the 7% now dominate more and more and more, and that something is actually missing. You know, why is it we haven't got more people in politics or the media that have come through the state school system? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. You know, I think one of the biggest social mistakes we've made over the course of the last 50 years was to abolish hundreds of grammar schools, many of which had for centuries given people from all backgrounds the chance to attain their best. And the evidence for that is the recent Ofsted report that said that 2/3 of the brightest youngsters are not attaining their best.
Look, I'm focusing on your criticism of the other parties for being, if you like,
yes.
establishment. Can we just talk about some of your, what you call People's Army, okay? You're the commander, but the generals. William Dartmouth, your foreign affairs spokesman, is he a kind of anti-establishment character? He's the 10th Earl of Dartmouth. He went to Eton.
Yes, the deputy leader of UKIP is called Paul Nuttall. He comes from Bootle.
Stuart Wheeler, he was party treasurer, anti-establishment.
And our immigration spokesman, Stephen Wolfe, comes from Moss Side, which I think at one point in time was the roughest estate in the whole of the country. And that's the point about UKIP.
Neil Hamilton, anti-establishment, former Tory MP.
We have got
Douglas Carswell, one of your MPs, educated at Charterhouse. Mark Reckless from Marlborough.
And what?
I mean,
and so tell me, tell me another party. Tell me another party.
All parties have people from public schools. I'm not suggesting that going to a public school disqualifies you from politics.
Well, I think
you're the one who pointed out the other parties.
You are missing the point about UKIP completely. Yes, you can quote the posh people in UKIP, and we've got them, of course. We have.
Half the people who you describe as key people on your website are privately educated or Oxbridge educated.
But you look at the number of genuinely working class people in UKIP, in senior positions in UKIP, and it's way ahead of the other parties. And we try to do things as a meritocracy.
Let's look at the policies, because you've said you want to help ordinary people.
Yep.
But when we look at the tax cuts you're proposing, one of them is to abolish inheritance tax. That's something that benefits the richest 6% of families and estates. You want to cut the top rate of tax.
No, we don't.
And you want to raise the 40p band.
Well, you ought to do your research a bit better, because you're wrong about the top rate of tax. We're not proposing at this
long-term aspiration to get the 45p rate down to 40p.
But it's not in this manifesto, because it's not a priority.
Okay. It's mentioned in the manifesto.
Since 2006, we've campaigned for no tax on the minimum wage. When we first said it, we were isolated. The Liberal Democrats picked up with that, and now others are beginning to follow us. So we've been arguing for taking below paid out of tax for a very, very long time. What we're now arguing is that there is a squeeze middle. There are people out there who are experienced nurses or police officers who are paying 40p tax, a level that was designed to be for those earning a very great deal of money.
Let's move on. And one of the great mysteries of British politics, or maybe it's not such a mystery, is that there's quite a high level of public support for some of the things that UKIP stands for. Control of immigration. Yeah. There are plenty of people who don't like the EU in this country. You could probably quote the figures better than I can. And yet, in the polls, 85% of the population say they're not going to vote UKIP. And even at your absolute peak in the European elections, you're still at sort of 70% of the population who don't choose to vote UKIP. So somehow you're scoring lower than the policies.
Well, actually...
Is this because there are a lot of people who think UKIP just has a faint whiff of meanness about it, or is a divisive party?
No, I mean, look, you know, given the history of British politics, for UKIP to have got to where it's got to is pretty remarkable. I mean, there have been scores of attempts over the last 60 or 70 years to get new parties off the ground, most of which, you know, have absolutely bombed. And this is not a top-down party. This was a grassroots welling up. I meet people on my doorsteps every day who say, I completely agree with you, but we're going to vote Labour, because we always have done, or I'm going to vote Tory, because we always have done. So we have a political system in Britain that chiefly, I think, because of the first past the post system, does keep a certain tribal loyalty to a colour. You know, we're reds or we're blues, as opposed to issues. On your second point, I mean, there has been, and I think this is because we're taking on the establishment, and I think this happens not just in politics, it happens in science, it happens in business. If you take on the consensus, they make life very hard for you. There has been a very consistent attempt to try and paint UKIP out to be something that it isn't.
I wonder, I mean, that could all be true. I wonder actually whether it's something to do with your tone and the way you talk about the issues such as immigration, which is a big part of your programme.
Yeah.
I want us to look at a clip of you. Now, this is you speaking to Fox Television in the US, not to voters here, earlier this year. Let's just have a look at that clip and get a comment.
Wherever you look, you see this blind eye being turned, and you see the growth of ghettos where the police and all the normal agents of the law have withdrawn, and that is where Sharia law has come in. Yeah.
Indeed. So where are these ghettos? Where are these ghettos?
Well, if you go to any part of France and speak to any French politician, they will tell you there are a lot.
You're talking about the UK.
Yeah. Well, that particular interview, I was talking about France, actually.
No, this is about the UK.
No, I have not said that. What I have said about the UK, well, certainly the bit I have said is
you've said there are no go areas in France, but this was, I think, about the UK.
Yeah,
definitely about the UK.
What I was saying about the UK, and I think they're different interviews, but nonetheless, what I've said about the UK is that uncontrolled mass immigration has led to increasing division and ghettoisation in our towns and cities.
Are there areas where the police and normal agents of the law have withdrawn and where Sharia has come in?
Not in... well, you could argue there are parts of the country where it's happened. In France, it's a much bigger problem than it is here, and that's what I was talking about. But you know, there are... we've had even the Archbishop...
It wasn't about France, it was about the UK.
Well, I
and
doubt...
you said wherever you look.
Wherever
you look.
I think you're wrong. But anyway, the point is this. Even up to the last Archbishop of Canterbury, we've had people saying that Sharia law should be acceptable in our cities. Now, you know,
well, I think he was somewhat misunderstood in that, and I think he
perhaps sometimes on these issues we all get misunderstood.
We have Jewish courts sometimes in this country. Yeah. We have Jewish courts in this country. Are you against those?
No, what I'm talking about is what is, you know, primary law. What is the law of the land? And are we...
So you resile from the phrase, wherever you look, you see a blind eye being turned, you see the growth of ghettos and Sharia law coming in. You didn't say it.
Well, the blind eye has been turned, and we've seen the consequences of that in some of our big northern cities. And with frankly, some of the most appalling sexual scandals that I think we've seen in our history, and that directly because the blind eye was turned.
Right. You call yourself straight talking. Now, last year you took out a full page ad in the Daily Telegraph.
Yep.
You claimed that 7% of all crime across the EU member states was caused by 240 Romanian gangs. Now, that wasn't correct, was it?
I believe it was.
No, it was 7% of all of criminal gangs were 240 Romanian gangs, not 7% of all crime. Well, now, if you're going to be straight-talking, if you're going to hit,
I think what that
you're straight-talking where you're going to hit these so-called taboo issues that no one else talks about, then you need to be a bit careful.
I think what that advert said also was there had been 28,000 arrests of one particular nationality within the Metropolitan Police area over the space of the last 5 years.
And I know some people quibbled with those figures as well. I didn't go into those because it's harder to get data on those, so it's harder to be sure. But we can be sure that you misunderstood the data about Romanian gangs. Does it worry you that if you sound off on foreign criminals, foreigners with HIV, you talk about our borders open to hundreds of millions of people,
which they are,
all of these things may be true. There are people with HIV. There are foreign criminals. All of these may be true. But if you make such a big, if you ramp up the rhetoric on these issues, many British people will say, look, this party is just not where I want it to be, with modern British values of tolerance, worldliness, and being a good global citizen.
To wake people up to the truth of what's going on, you sometimes have to say things in a way to get noticed. Of that, there's no question. However, political parties evolve and change. And if you look at the way UKIP is fighting this general election, everything through our manifesto, to all the speeches I've given all over the country, what I'm saying is this: we no longer need to make the negative arguments about the effect that immigration has had on primary school places, on healthcare provision, on wage compression. The argument we are now making is that we're the one party that firstly offers a solution, which is to take back control of our borders, and secondly has a positive and an ethical vision for how immigration should be managed by having an Australian-style point system. And I think so.
But you know, I'm actually not quibbling with the policy. I'm not even. I'm not really trying to talk to you about the policy. I'm trying to talk to you about the tone. Let's move on. You've talked about a fifth column.
And I'm answering. Who hate us. And I'm answering by saying this to you, by saying that in order to get the public aware of some of these issues, perhaps at times that tone had to be used. But you are not hearing, but hang on, you are not hearing, and you're interviewing me now as we approach a general election, you are not hearing that tone from me.
You talked about a fifth column. You talked about a fifth column this year. This is within a few months. You talked about a fifth column. The Muslim religion, people who come and don't want to be part of our culture. There's no previous experience in our history of a migrant group coming to Britain that wants to change who we are.
I haven't talked about the Muslim religion like that.
But this is, I'm quoting you from January.
I've talked about a mercifully small percentage of the Muslim population. So if you're going to quote me, let's get it right, okay? A mercifully small percentage of the Muslim religion.
Who is the fifth column?
Well, the fifth column are those within that wish to fight us. Now look,
are those who sympathise?
I do not.
Those who sympathise with Charlie Hebdo, for example, would they be a fifth column?
Those that are prepared to act upon it would be a fifth column.
Right.
And as we know,
so
something like 700, maybe 1,000 British people have gone to fight in Syria. So we know this exists. We have seen examples of this in France. We've seen examples of this in Britain. We've seen examples of this in Denmark. Should we be concerned about it? Yes, of course we should.
Of course we should. You've talked about Muslims. You've talked about Judeo-Christian. You've talked about. You mentioned other Muslims.
No, I'm not having this.
Well, let's.
No, I'm not having this.
Put that aside.
I'm not going to put that aside. I have said.
Okay, you've talked about some Muslims.
A mercifully small percentage.
Some of the people who've come here and who are of the Muslim religion.
So let's be clear.
Some of the people who've come here and who are of the Muslim religion. You've talked about Judeo-Christian heritage.
Yes.
You talk of being uncomfortable on a train where everyone else is speaking a different language. You've talked in recent days of giving homes to Christian refugees and only Christian refugees from the troubled zones of the Middle East and North Africa. Aren't people entitled to think that as a party, and you as the leader, are happier with some migrants than other migrants, based on ethnic or national background, and nothing to do with the skills or the languages that they bring?
Well, do you think it would be a good idea if you had if you were running your own immigration policy, which of course Britain doesn't, because we're EU members, do you think it'd be a good idea to get a lot of people to come who didn't speak English? Do you think that would aid and abet integration in society? Well, the answer, of course, to that clearly is no. Do I think...
Do you favour some immigrants? Let's suppose one from Mogadishu, with the same skills, the same ability to speak English, but not as a first language, from one from Melbourne,
Do you have a
preference? Do you have a preference?
I have to confess, I do have a slight preference. I do think, naturally, that people from India and Australia are in some ways more likely to speak English, understand common law and have a connection with this country than some people that come perhaps from countries that haven't fully recovered from being behind the Iron Curtain. But that's irrelevant. When you have an Australian-style point system, what you do is you take out of that all subjectivity, and you look at things on a purely objective basis.
So you don't give points for being Australian or points for being Judeo-Christian?
No, you get points because you've got languages and skills.
But why wouldn't you? Because you just said you'd prefer the Judeo-Christian or the Commonwealth immigrants.
Yeah, look, this country has long associations and links with Australia, with India, with countries like that, all right? And we have been friends together in crisis many, many times. And what we've done is we've turned our backs on them. We've turned our backs on them in terms of trade by making life very difficult for them. And we've really become a country whose political elite and much of whose media elite are totally incapable of thinking about the world outside the European club.
You say that. In fact, your manifesto says the liberal metropolitan elite often tells us patriotism is wrong. Who is this liberal metropolitan elite who says patriotism is wrong?
Well, I think you only have to look at the tweet, and I won't name her because that would be really quite nasty, but a certain Labour MP put out a tweet of a chap with a white van and with a cross of St George outside his house, as if to say, look at these ghastly people. And there is too much of that. There is too much snobbery. And actually, that's what it's about. It is London-based snobbery about the way ordinary folk feel. And out there in the country, a lot of people are unashamedly patriotic, and that's considered to be awful in London.
I don't know. I just wonder whether there are different patriotic visions, and there are certain people who you would call liberal metropolitan elite who have a different vision of Britain. Did you see the Paddington Bear movie last year?
No.
Terrific movie with a rather sort of moving, in a sense, proclamation of the virtues of multiculturalism, which I know you hate because he's a bear and he's different and he feels very at home and is made to feel welcome here.
I think using the word...
Would that be a sort of metropolitan elite movie that is kind of a travesty of British patriotism and British values?
The fact that you throw the word in hate like that as a sort of off-the-cuff comment...
But you have lots of insults
as if, of course, Mr Farage hates things... What's your evidence for that?
Well, you said in your manifesto, you say multiculturalism is divisive.
What is your evidence that I hate it?
But you say it's divisive. You say it's a politically correct experiment. A political correction experiment, you've called it.
You've just used a very strong word, and I'm picking up on it. I don't hate anything.
You don't hate multiculturalism?
I don't hate multiculturalism. Right, but
you don't like it. Can we go that far?
We have made some real mistakes with state-sponsored multiculturalism and division within society, and that's something which, when I was saying it a few years ago, was considered to be dreadful. Now people like Trevor Phillips say it.
Look, was it patriotic to support Mo Farah when he won his gold medals in the Olympic Games?
I thought he was fantastic. I thought the interview after he'd won that second gold medal, and it was that Saturday night, and we were all there cheering at home, watching it, and there was a reporter interviewed him and said, well, wouldn't you really have rather won this medal?
Right. Well, that wasn't he wasn't metropolitan elite to that report.
And Mo Farah's answer was, listen, mate, I have made this my home. I am British, and I'm proud to.
One of your candidates, one of your local government candidates.
That I think really did epitomise what this country can and should be,
and with the right. One of your local government candidates, one of his local, put on his Facebook page, can somebody explain, Mo Farah, African from Somalia, who trains in America, won a gold medal for Great Britain. Now, is he more patriotic than the liberal metropolitan elite,
I tell you what's interesting,
who you attack for non-patriotic
well, let me
in your manifesto?
Let me now attack the liberal metropolitan elite in the shape of you talking to me, all right? When you interviewed David Cameron, when you interviewed Miliband and Clegg, did you go through a list of their not just council candidates?
No, I'm asking about his patriotism and the notion of patriotism.
But it's very interesting
that you use accusing other people of being unpatriotic.
It's very interesting that you do what everybody in the liberal metropolitan elite does. You pick up a comment from somebody in UKIP, made on Facebook, probably late at night. What you never do is challenge the other leaders about why their elected councillors
those other parties,
and officials
don't go round,
are serving prison sentences.
No one says
are serving prison
you're
sentences
unpatriotic
for paedophilia, are serving prison sentences for racial assault, and yet just one person in UKIP says this, and you attempt to portray that as being the party.
No one says you're unpatriotic.
And it's not.
No one says you're unpatriotic. You go to the US and talk about Sharia ghettos in Europe. No one says you're unpatriotic for that. You're the party that says other people are going around making patriotism seem like a sin. I suspect some people, I think, simply think you're living or yearning for a country that has moved on. I'm going to give you one last example, okay? This is another one. This is not about race, because I think this is about a different age in a way. It's about breastfeeding, okay? Now, you called it common sense that women in a public place who want to breastfeed a baby should maybe go into the corner to do that, so other people don't feel awkward about it. Now, tell me why the woman should go into the corner.
You are trying terribly hard here.
I'm trying to get across.
No, you're trying terribly hard. Let me tell you what I said. I was asked the question about this. There'd been a big row with Claridge's. I said, look, personally, I'm not bothered about this at all. But I know that
other people are.
But some other people are. And so the question that was asked of me, so do you think women should be sent into the toilet to breastfeed? And I said, no, I don't think that. Perhaps asked to sit in the corner. And classic of the way this operates, this is Farage is against breastfeeding mothers. I couldn't care less.
Right. But would you argue that it would be as suitable for people who feel awkward when the woman wants to breastfeed the baby, for them to go and stand in the corner and the woman to stay where she is?
In this particular case, it was people who'd paid a lot of money to go to Claridge's for tea, and some of them didn't like it. But I couldn't care less.
OK. Look, let's move on very briefly on your manifesto. Before we talk about, ask a question or two on this manifesto, your last manifesto, it had your name in it, actually. You signed the bottom of the introduction.
The 11-page foreword.
You called it straight talking. You defended it on TV, and then you then said last year, I didn't read it. It was drivel. It was nonsense.
I was asked to look at I wasn't the leader of the UKIP, but I was asked to look at an 12-page document, which I read. I thought, well, this all looks really rather sensible, and I was quite happy to append my name to it. I subsequently learned that 486 pages, I mean, not quite War and Peace, but almost getting there, had been put up on our website and called the manifesto. And clearly that was a massive mistake, and it was a nonsense.
And it was a nonsense. But it was straight talking. That was on each page, I think, of the manifesto last time. Was it straight talking then?
Well, the 12 pages was, all right, but the 486 wasn't, and it was incoherent, and it was actually the kind of mistake that happens with a small political party with almost no budget at all. These,
let's talk about this manifesto.
It takes time.
Let's talk about this manifesto. You've made a lot of spending commitments in the manifesto. A number of them have been costed. You've got a lot of savings that you make in the manifesto. They've been costed. Overall, I think you save $5 billion. But you say you want to clear the deficit, or the current deficit, by 2017, which is going to take another $30 billion or so. Where's that? How are you going to pay for that?
Well, firstly, we have looked at the government's future projections for what they're going to do, and said we will. Hopefully, this time they'll keep to them, and we'll stick with them. But there's another factor to this, and that is one of the arguments that has been lost completely with an economic policy, which is, I know, very much your area. The argument almost is, a pound here, a pound there, that if we cut taxes by a pound here, there has to be a compensating increase somewhere else in revenues. Actually, there is a dynamic force with tax cuts. That if tax cuts are significant, and what we would propose.
But you're not proposing significant enough ones to earn revenues rather than lose revenues, are you?
Hang on, 18.
Is that the basis of your economics, that you're going to cut taxes and hope more money comes in?
By cutting taxes by £18 billion, I think there is a very strong argument that says that will lead to dynamic growth within the economy. And we certainly saw examples of this. Going back in time, we have seen examples of this. No, we're not.
Well, that's okay. That's a very clear statement of your hope
we're not saying,
how to get the deficit down.
We're not saying
you're going to cut taxes. We're
not saying we're relying on it entirely, but I think there is a reasonably good reason. good basis of historical fact to think that might work.
Look, just a couple of things. You've costed this manifesto and you've had it independently audited, but there are a lot of proposals that are not costed in there. Smaller car class sizes, that's not included in the costings. How much is that going to cost?
Well, I think it's all costed, actually, and that is why
smaller class sizes isn't. We've looked at the table.
Well, you better go and have that argument with the think tank that looked at it all right?
Border agency, an extra 2,500 staff.
But of course, if you have controlled immigration, you will have smaller class sizes, particularly at
you don't know what the costs are. Getting schools to provide childcare. You don't.
Well,
it's not costed.
Well, we've said parents would get involved in that. That
okay.
actually, what we try to do is to try. We talk a lot about early years childcare in this country, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, and we talk about 15 hours a week, or should it be more, that the government helps with. What doesn't really get talked about is the fact that from 5 years old, children are going to school from whether it's from 9 o'clock till 3:30 or whatever. Actually, we're talking there about providing a framework where there could be wraparound childcare from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening,
and that's going to cost nothing.
And using people.
That's going to cost nothing.
And using people who are volunteers. Obviously with the right checks and everything else.
We're just about out of time. After the Rochester and Stroud by-election, you talked about winning dozens of MPs.
I never said that. I'm very careful.
You didn't say you would.
Ever
you
put a number on
it. You didn't say you would.
No,
you said, can we do this in a few dozen seats or whatever the number it may be? Yeah. We can. So you referred to dozens of MPs. My question is, what are you hoping for now?
We are targeting several dozen seats, exactly as I said we would.
How many do you think you can win? What will be a good night? What will be a bad night for you?
There are really three criteria that you...
Criteria, not seats, right.
There are 3 criteria that UKIP will be measured on. Have we got a decent number of people over the line in first place? Have we got more than a handful, maybe in the double figures?
More than a handful,
whatever. That's the first criteria. Second criteria is what is our share of the national vote. And the third criteria, longer term for the party, is how many seats have we come second in? Okay. And what does that mean longer term for politics? We have, as a party, through 2013 and 2014, jumped some pretty incredible hurdles. This one, as I look at it, is like Beecher's Brook. It's a big hurdle. If we get over this and land safely on the other side, then I think UKIP's potential is massive.
Right. You have said you will resign as leader of UKIP if you don't win Thanet South. Do you regret saying that? Because the polls have by no means make it that likely.
I don't regret it at all, no. The truth is...
So you may be in the last couple of weeks now of your leadership of the party.
Well, David Cameron could be in the last 2 weeks of his leadership. Miliband could be in the last 2 weeks. Clegg could be... I mean, look, we can all be gone.
Your party is often accused of being a one-man band.
One person will come through. No, look, I believe that I've given everything to try to make UKIP a political success. But I have to get over this particular Beecher's Brook. I'm confident, and I believe that I will.
You, must have found it very gruelling. You are a big part of what the party's public face is. You've had at least one night where you haven't been sleeping, and I know that. I just wonder whether you're going to look forward to when all this is over, and whether you're operating at 100% at the moment.
I think, to be honest with you, in the earlier part of the campaign, I wasn't. And I wasn't feeling quite as sharp and as fit as I should have been. And I think that's because, frankly, in my enthusiasm for UKIP to succeed in this election, I got my diary planning wrong, and I was doing way, way too much. I've readjusted that. And I have to say, the last 2 or 3 days, I'm feeling pretty bouncy. Back to being a bit more like Tigger. I'm enjoying it and looking forward to the next fortnight.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Leader interviews continue next Monday night at 7:30 when Evan Davis interviews SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon.